Hi everybody, this is Matthew Poes of Poes Acoustics, and I'm answering questions. So, Slavivaniu, I don't know if I pronounced that right, I apologize. Slavivaniu, 765, Slavivanyuk. He said, "Hi Poe. I do want to mention, because I get this a lot, it's Poes with an S at the end. It's very likely that the original spelling was actually P-O-Z or P-U-Z. We don't really know for sure, but we do know that the spelling that we have today, my grandfather came up with, so it's a fairly recent one, but I'm not in any way, shape, or form related to Edgar Allan Poe or that lineage. My family comes from Eastern Europe, so Poes. I have a question about DIRAC and room correction software in general. My understanding is that up to around 500 hertz, speakers interact more with the room, and so the room correction software is correcting for the room, but roughly above 500 hertz, it begins to correct for the speaker, as this is when how much speaker interact with the room, especially while treated, goes down. Is this correct? Does it make sense to correct much further above 500 hertz, especially in treated room, or do you usually correct for the full spectrum no matter what? If cutoff is different from system to system, how do you find the right limit for the upper curtain? Also, when correcting, do you manually add points on the curve to lower peaks? If after all the measurements... so now we're getting into something else, actually. Before I don't want to get into that, I want to answer the first one. So I have covered, I think, in earlier videos, but it probably would be worth doing a whole series on this again, the zones you have in a room. So everybody's, I think, familiar with the concept of the crossover frequency between the modal region and the stochastic region. That the stochastic refers to statistical region, so just think of it as the area where there's lots of room reflections that are so on top of each other and so close together that you can't really discern reflection from speaker. And as you get higher and higher frequency, because of the shorter wavelengths, what you find is that the sound you hear is dominated more by the speaker than the room in a lot of ways, but not entirely. Below that crossover point, you have what's known as the modal region. So in the sort of classical acoustic theory, you would basically describe it as those two zones. But anybody who's read Floyd Toole's book knows that realistically it's more nuanced than that. That's the better way to put it. And the more nuanced would be to say that there's actually a crossover region. And that crossover region is an area where there's evidence of the stochastic zone and there's evidence of the modal region. They kind of overlap. So yes, the modes start to be more on top of each other, but you still start to get some distinct modal behavior up higher than that. So in most well-treated rooms of modest size, this crossover point is going to be under 150 hertz. Definitely under 200 hertz unless it's a really tiny room and not all that well treated. I think my room with the treatment in it, it's probably 80 or 90 hertz, right? It actually gets pretty low, this crossover point. And yet you will see that there is some evidence of modal behavior up above that there's that transition point. So there is some argument to be made that EQing, especially manual EQing, using PEQ. So when I say EQing manually, in general, most of you, like 99.9% of you, are going to be restricted to using IIR, or infinite impulse response type EQ. So it's going to be things like PEQ filters. You're not going to be able to generate your own FIR correction. And so you're not going to be able to do mixed phase correction. You're going to be stuck doing these IIR type filters only, which fit really well with correcting two problems. One is when you've got minimum phase behavior from modes and minimum phase behavior from the speaker itself. And so those are the two things you can correct with these PEQ filters really well. And so keeping it below 500 hertz, which is just a kind of made up number, something to keep in mind. It's not an exact number. But keeping it under 500 hertz tends to ensure that as long as you're focused on the big peaks and you're reducing those big peaks, you're generally going to get a better sounding improvement than you would if you were to try to apply a lot of correction above that point, which could be utilizing minimum phase filters to actually address mixed phase problems. So for manual correction, we do typically keep it under 500 hertz for most of what we do. And anything that's built around this infinite impulse response type correction filters, so again, PEQ filters, meaning minimum phase correction, will work best when it's below that. Now, professionals, myself included, will look at what's happening above that because sometimes there's a flaw in the speaker, or there's something happening in the room where we need to make some adjustments. And so occasionally we'll see a little peak somewhere. You know, we've taken thorough measurements, we're certain that this peak is persistent in multiple positions, it's audible, and we will add a filter to remove that. That would be minimum phase. Okay, so that's the general idea you're talking about. Now, there has been an argument to say, well, you could apply some of this correction all the way up to like 5 kilohertz. You just have to be really careful. Like, focus on the big stuff, not on the really high Q stuff. And don't try to make it too flat, because you're probably going to make it worse. But then, what's DIRAC? Well, DIRAC is not a minimum phase correction system. It's a mixed phase correction system. It handles both minimum phase and non-minimum phase problems. And so the method by which it develops its filters is going to be a mix of PEQ filters and FIR filters. And the FIR filters can be specifically tailored to address these non-minimum phase problems. And so it can go all the way up to 20 kilohertz because it can provide a phase correction filter for the speaker. It can linearize the response. So something to keep in mind, which is why they've done what they've done, is that if you're able to separate out the response of the speaker from the reflections in the room, remember that speakers in general are not perfectly flat. You know, if they're like a really, really amazing speaker that's extremely well engineered, and especially if it's like digital, DSP based, yes, it probably has a very, very flat response. But in many cases, that's not true. And so for a lot of speakers, there are some peaks and dips that exceed 1 dB, which very well may be audible. And something like DIRAC is able to separate out the anechoic from the non-anechoic, find these issues and correct them. Now, I'm not saying it does it perfectly, and I'm not saying you want it to do that. I'm just saying that's part of the theory for how it works, and it has that capability. And so it can actually linearize the response of the speaker. It can shape the response to fit a target, which is always good, whether you're doing minimum phase or non-minimum phase. So even if you're doing mixed phase, if you're doing just minimum phase correction manually, you still want to be able to apply shelf filters, for instance, to generally tilt and shape the response so that it has the right balance in the room. Ideally, the speaker will have that naturally, but that's not always true, and so you sometimes have to apply that to get the right sound. Even if it does have it naturally, the person whose system it is that you're tuning, be it yours or somebody else's, may not like that, and you may have to adjust it a little bit. Or, you know, as Floyd often mentions with the whole circle of confusion, you may not like the sound of a particular recording on a properly tuned system because the recording itself was poorly engineered, and applying shelf filters to correct the response for that recording can be good. He refers to it as tone filters, but most modern systems don't really have tone filters anymore, like a bass and treble control. And so what you can do is create, in the case of something like Trinnov, for instance, a preset, or Storm for that matter, that has these bass and treble controls already adjusted in a common way, because there's sort of a common amount of adjustment that's needed for these recordings. So you can, so that's gets at that. Now with these mixed phase corrections, like I said, you're able to address issues that you just couldn't do manually. That can be a good idea, and it helps to improve the response to the system. And then when you get into some of the newer technology like waveforming and art, well, now we're not even dealing with the typical MIMO and CMO type systems. We're actually dealing with, well, I'm sorry, I take that back. I said not dealing with MIMO. We are now dealing with MIMO instead of the MISO type systems of the past. So now instead of having a multiple measurement, single speaker correction, we can actually have a multiple measurement, multiple speaker correction, and where other speakers are used to shape the response and get rid of the reflections from a specific speaker. Now this can only be done in the bass, below 150 hertz or so, with current technology without a lot of problems. In theory you can go higher than that, but you need a lot more speakers with specific placement and blah, 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 and it tends to create some errors if it doesn't get it right. So current systems, we tend to focus primarily on below 150 hertz, but the point is they are MIMO-based. We can use other speakers to correct the low-frequency response and improve it. And this is ideally done using FIR, mixed phase filters as well. And so these are all things that like you can't do on your own. It requires basically an algorithm with data to be fed in. You know, is it conceivable for somebody to do it? Of course it is. The scientists the engineers at DIRAC were able to do this, and there are other people as smart as them who could figure out how to do this. This isn't a completely novel idea. It had been written up in research papers for about a decade, maybe more. But there's a difference between what's been done in research papers and what it takes to implement it in a consumer system. You can't take, for instance, as far as I know, something like a mini DSP and apply these filters manually in the mini DSP to do the same thing. You could probably come up with something that's more crude, not as advanced. So you could probably come up with something that's relying primarily on specially designed. Well, I don't know how you do feed-forward filtering, though. So the reason why I don't know that you could do this with a mini DSP is that it has to use feed-forward filtering. Basically, you have to be able to apply a filter that is correcting the response at the point in time that the reflection is happening, but without touching the direct sound signal that's supposed to go to the speaker, which would happen earlier in time. And that's the thing I don't know how to do. I mean, maybe you could apply a delay to that portion of the filter. I don't know. It might be possible to program something like this in an FIR program and then output it and put it in, but I don't think so. I'm kind of on a tangent in my head right now. I'm just thinking, like, could somebody do this? I'm guessing the answer is no. There might be other ways to do it using other hardware or even a computer, but as far as I know, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to do with typical things. It's why when somebody goes and says, oh, these systems are crude and basic, and if you know what you're doing, professionals can manually do a much better job. I get a little bit put off by that because it misunderstands what's going on. The reality is you can't do what they're doing. You could argue that what they're doing is not desirable, but you can't argue that what you're doing is better or more advanced. It's actually significantly less advanced. It's significantly less complex to do. It's just that sometimes a lighter touch can actually yield better sounding results. So we have certainly had situations where using DIRAC or even using Optimizer in Trinnov yields a result that actually doesn't sound better. And it seems that the system ultimately sounds better with the really excellent speaker being largely untouched. I would say, though, that this tends to be true above 500 hertz, to use the number here. Above 500 hertz, sometimes just a light touch sounds the best. Below 500 hertz, I've never found it to be the best sounding when it's got a light touch. I tend to find that it sounds its best when you've properly processed it to eliminate the effects of the modes. Now, again, getting into that, you could argue that if you get to the point of it being too extreme, it wouldn't sound good, but I think that's very subjective at that point. Like, with these MIMO systems, you can make it sound like anechoic bass. There's an argument to be made that we don't want anechoic bass, and that's not actually desirable. That having some room reflections and room decay is actually a positive attribute, and it's something that we seek and expect in the sound. Now, in the case of waveforming, you can actually adjust the decay control, and so you can make it so it does ring out longer. In the case of DIRAC, I don't remember if there's a way to do that now. I don't think there is quite the same way to do it if there is a way. But in any case, the bigger point here being that's a subjective opinion. There are other people who would find that to be very desirable and much prefer the sound. All right, well, so I hope that's helpful. I hope I've answered that part of the question. Now, the next one says, also when correcting, do you manually add points on the curve to lower peaks if, after all the measurements and applying initial curve, you can still see peaks with REW because software isn't compensating enough to flatten the response? Yes, although it's a little more complicated than that, I think. So one thing to keep in mind is you do want to take lots of measurements and very carefully analyze what it's doing and why. So sometimes with DIRAC, I definitely get weird results I can't explain. Like, they don't make any sense. And in fact, that's true of Optimizer and Odyssey as well. So any of these automatic correction systems, there are situations where for whatever reason, it's clearly misinterpreting the speaker. I know that what it's doing is wrong. And so I need to actually adjust the target curve to compensate for that. So I basically invert the mistake that it's making so that it doesn't create that. One example, and I'm not the only one who's found this, which is how I started to discover it was a legitimate issue. So with Perlistens, it appears that a bunch of the correction systems are doing this, and I want to investigate this further with DIRAC and Odyssey now. But I first noticed it with Trinnov's Optimizer. The Optimizer shows this like really significant roll-off in the high frequencies. And it was weird because I'd actually seen it in Aaron, Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner. When he measured the Perlisten bookshelf speakers, he also had measured this like kind of roll-off in the high frequencies. And I remember thinking it was kind of odd because it wasn't in Perlisten's own measurements. Now, I've measured this speaker myself using a microphone that uses a 1/4-inch capsule that is flat out to 70 kilohertz. It's got a NIST certification. Like, I'm 100% that this microphone is accurate. Over at Perlisten, they're using a grass microphone. It also is a 1/4-inch capsule. It also has the NIST certification. It also is definitely flat out, well past the range of the speaker, right? So they've measured it. They've even measured it on a clipboard for that matter. I've measured it. James Larson has measured the S7Ts and some of the others. And I've consistently found that with the 1/4-inch capsule microphone pointed at the speaker, whether it's inside or outside, it is dead flat, well past 30 kilohertz. And so, and that's true over, I mean, it actually it's not like it falls off right off axis. Some speakers do that, they beam at like above 15 kilohertz. The speaker doesn't really beam above 15 kilohertz, not in any unusual way. And so here's what I was finding though with the Perlistens was that in room, the Trinnov shows actually an even steeper roll-off than I had seen in some of these other measurements. And then if I take and use my reference microphone, it's not there. It's a dead flat response. And if I allow it to correct, what's happening is it's actually introducing a big peak in the high frequencies that shouldn't be there. And it's quite audible. So even though it's really high, like above 15 kilohertz, because of the amount of boost that's being applied, it does actually create an audible artifact that isn't good. So I literally invert this mistake in the target curve to prevent it from doing that. And sure enough, it leads to a much better sound. I had actually mentioned this to some of my colleagues that I work with who had all said, who had worked with Perlisten as well, who had said, oh yeah, I've noticed that too, that's weird. And so many of them have done the same thing. We're still trying to figure out the actual cause of it. We don't know what the cause is. As I said, I recently realized that it's not only happening in the Trinnov software, it's happening in some other softwares as well. But we've been able to confirm with absolute certainty that it is not actually in the speaker, that it's some sort of interaction, some sort of error in the interaction between the speaker and these measurement correction systems. So that's one example. Others would be sometimes you see peaks and dips. So here's where things get kind of tricky though. Sometimes you see these peaks and dips because you're measuring at a single point in space, or maybe you're taking a couple of measurements in this point in space and it's introduced this, let's say, peak in the response you want to get rid of. But if you take a spatial average across all the listening areas that were used when DIRAC did its correction, you find that the response is flat. So if you remove that peak that it added, you may be adding a dip to these other seats. So you want to make sure you've carefully considered that before you do that. That may be okay. What I would say is if you're doing that, personally, I would go back and recorrect the system using a smaller area for measurements. Because if you're using, let's say, these 3 seats, or you're using, let's say, all 6 seats, like I have here in the correction, and then it's applying correction that you're trying to get rid of in this seat, then don't use those other seats. Focus your measurements in an area that doesn't introduce that error. That may be a better way to go than to try to undo it in the correction. But even DIRAC, for what it's worth, tells you that if you've got some sort of weird peak and you want to get rid of it, apply that to the target curve, invert it basically, so that it doesn't do it anymore. So if you've got a peak where you don't want it, add a dip. So yes, I do that. I hope that's helpful. Oh, I should mention with all this, the Q is really important. Like if it's really high Q, over 5 or 6, probably don't touch it. It's just not worth it. It's not going to be particularly audible, and it's very likely being caused by reflections, and so it's just nothing to really worry too much about. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. If you don't like the video, let me know in the comments. If you do like the video, let me know in the comments. The interactions are great. So thanks everybody. Appreciate it. Keep on watching.